Hello and welcome to the Happy Insights podcast. My name is Happy Ali. I am very excited to have you join me for today's show because I have a wonderful guest. His name is Stephen Washington. He is the author of Recovering You, Soul Care and Mindful Movement for Overcoming Addiction. As a former professional dancer who performed on Broadway in Disney's The Lion King, his love for movement inspired him to become the highly acclaimed Qigong and Pilates teacher that he is today. Stephen lives a joyful life of recovery and is passionate about helping others as they navigate towards health and happiness. He offers Qigong, Pilates, dance, meditation, laughter, and more through his website, which I will give at the end of this episode, and you can see it in the bio. So without further ado, I would like to introduce Stephen Washington. Welcome to the show.
Thank you, Happy. Lovely to be here. I've heard lovely things about you.
I'm glad you said lovely because usually people hear funny things about me now. Welcome. Thank you so much. I really appreciate your kind words. I am so excited to have you on the show today because you are talking my language. I am a dancer at heart. I've always had issues with addiction. I love your husband's work. That was a really cool thing. I think you're lucky you have access to really cool things in your world. And you are someone who is really devoting his life to bettering the world and making a difference. And I think I admire that so much. And thank you for joining me. Can you tell me what caused you to want to write this book?
Very good question. Well, what caused me to write Recovering You was a desire to really share what my experiences have been in recovery and sharing all the self-care tools that I've picked up along the way. I started writing Recovering You in 2020, so right in the middle of the pandemic. And I felt as though that was a time when all of my self-care practices really mattered in a tremendous way. It's kind of like when the rubber meets the road. And I felt as though I wanted to share all the things that I've learned since I began my journey of recovery. And I just feel that self-care is so important. I think that as people who are in addiction or in recovery with addiction challenges, self-care is an issue. When we're in active addiction, taking care of ourselves the best way that we possibly can is not always a priority. And so it takes time, it takes effort, it takes work in order to develop a self-care practice. And even if you are in recovery, it's still, self-care isn't second nature. So I wanted to provide just a myriad of tools that people can use, from mindful movement to journal writing, to self-massage, to self-inquiry, to other somatic experiences that people can have in order to take better care of themselves and also recover parts that they've lost due to addiction. So that was my main inspiration for writing the book.
And after reading the book, I have to say that you don't have to be a recovering addict to read and enjoy and get a lot out of this book. Because I feel like this book is for everybody because we're all addicted to something. And I think self-care is so important. Everything you just talked about is something that every single human being should be aware of and really pay attention to. So I think, just as my opinion, I think anybody who is alive and breathing should check this book out. By the way, I have the manuscript. It's Recovering You, and by Stephen Washington. And I really, really enjoyed reading it because it was full of tips and exercises. It wasn't a book that you just read and go through. There were pictures and descriptions of movement and so many amazing things that I felt that I could get a lot out of personally. But I feel like the question that I want to ask is, how do you know when to use these exercises? And we'll get into other stuff too, but I feel like there's a lot of good tools, but as an addict or someone who's recovering or someone who is just not present in the moment, how do you find yourself to catch your triggers and move towards an exercise or a movement?
Right. Good question. I think that a good indication of when to use these practices, which are really are applicable at any time, but over and over in the book, I remind people that these practices are useful ways to help us to self regulate and self soothe. One of the reasons that I know in my experience as a recovering addict, an alcoholic, I use substances to help me self-soothe and self-regulate. I didn't realize that's what I was doing. That was what I was doing, but ultimately that's what I was doing. So this process that I've been through in my recovery is just picking up these tools that help me to do that in a more healthy way. So any of the tools in the book, whether it's the movement, the book is really focused around movement because I feel as though movement is a wonderful way to process and help move emotional energy throughout the body. So there are many different practices in the book that one can tap into when you're feeling stressed, when you're feeling triggered. Take a deep breath. There's some self-massage techniques in the book as well. That's very useful to help us to manage stress. And the movement practices. The movement practices in the book come at the end of each chapter. And that's for a specific reason, because through the chapter, you're going to go on an emotional journey looking at isolation, looking at fear, looking at shame, and other subjects related to addiction. And I want the reader to really pull on that emotional energy and try to process it and move through it through movement and breath. It's a really powerful practice. And I feel as though the best way to use it is in those moments when you feel as though you need something to help ground you. Because life is very busy, life is very chaotic, life can be very stressful, and we need practices that will help bring us back to the moment. And there's no better way to do that than with the breath and connecting to your body.
And I really do agree because I feel like channeling energy or releasing energy, pent up energy really does help clear your head, release the negative emotions that are trapped. And, I think even for people who are going through trauma or have experienced trauma, movement is really important because a trauma gets trapped in the body. And I feel like a lot of the things that you teach are ways that you can release trapped emotions, basically. You agree?
Absolutely.
So, yeah, so that I thought that was like a good crossover because I really, really want to emphasize how this book is just not for addicts,
Mm-mm.
and
It's
we're
for
always,
everyone.
yeah, as we're always recovering from something, what
Absolutely. I feel as though recovery is just another word for change, transformation. And we're always going through some sort of change or transformation. This book is for everyone. And I think about it in terms of people who are in addiction, but I also think about all the people around those who are suffering with addiction, how they need support as well. And I don't think there's any one of us, I don't think there's anyone on the planet that doesn't know someone, who isn't connected to someone, who doesn't love someone who is dealing with this. And so it's a tool that can be used and helpful for families and friends and all different types of relationships.
I am recommending it to someone who I just spoke to. I am a spiritual life purpose coach, and I just spoke to somebody who has a child that's going through a heavy case of addiction, and she just didn't know what to do. And I
Mm,
feel now that I read it, because I read it recently, I always read my books really close to the interview.
yeah.
Now that I read it, I feel like I need to hand it over to her and also not only have her read it, but have her son read it because I feel like a lot of times for addicts or people just going through anything, there's a level of shame and fear, which you address. And that's what I wanted to talk about a little bit because first there's shame, and the shame doesn't mean they're ashamed of what other people think of them. Usually the shame is about who you are, it's internal. And the
Yes.
fear usually is being afraid and fearful that this is going to be your life forever. And those are the things that I feel that are very, very strong in many people going through addiction. So, can you talk about shame or fear, in whichever order that you feel you'd like to talk about? And just for someone who's going through that, what is your advice?
Mm. I'll start with fear because I feel as though fear is woven into so many different aspects of life, so many different aspects of addiction. It's it affects everyone. It affects everyone. And the interesting thing that I've discovered around fear is that oftentimes the things that I have feared, let me just speak for myself, the things I have feared most in my life are things that have never come to fruition. So much of it is in my mind, it's in my body. It's in my body, and like many people, I think in addiction, like an overly sensitive um, nervous system that like has this. It's almost like an exposed nerve that is easily irritated, and so fear is just that emotion that is so accessible for many of us. But what I wanted to share in the book and show people through the work is that there are ways to manage their fear. And one of the things that has been most useful for me in managing my fears is to not keep it inside, is to share my fears with other people. Oftentimes, we don't share our fears with others because we're afraid that people are going to judge us because we are afraid of this, that, or the other. And what I've come to understand in my recovery is that when I share my fear or my problem, the problem is halved. And you let people in to help you manage that fear or that situation that you're finding challenging. So sharing your fears is an important part of the process of moving beyond it. I also found it beneficial to write down what my fears are and then really look at them one by one and think of those fears and think about in my mind playing out the worst case scenario of those fears. Like, what happens if this thing that I'm afraid of actually happens? Just play it to the end and see what that worst case scenario is. And just that process, sometimes it allows you to set yourself free from it. Because underlying the fear, I think, is this feeling that if this thing happens, I won't know how to cope. I won't know how to go on. I won't know how to handle this. But the truth of the matter is, if you've made it thus far, you'll make it even further. This thing that you're afraid of won't be the end of you, but it starts by sharing and acknowledging that fear and working through it. You were going to say something.
Well, one of the fears people have, and I'm not going to speak for everyone, but a lot of people have, is fear of sharing their fears.
Mm-hmm.
Because that sounds scary to many people, and I know so many people just want to let their fears just reside inside because they are afraid of what people are going to think when they share their fears.
Yes, this is true. And I think that that's a common fear. And a person can only move beyond that fear when they're ready to move beyond it. I know for me, I got to the point where I had to move beyond my fear because the alternative was for me to continue living my life the way I'd been living, and that wasn't working. So I was desperate enough to try something new. I was desperate enough to ask for help.
And I know most people reading this book, because it is about addiction and overcoming addiction, they've probably already hit rock bottom, or they've already got to the point of overwhelmment where they feel like they know that they have no other choice but to do something.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe what I was asking for was more for people who don't know exactly how an addict feels or what they're going through, because a true addict who's going through recovery has already been to that dark space where they just know, if I
Mm-hmm.
don't do something, my life is going to be just this. And then it brings me to the topic of shame, because once you do tell people, or once you really go within, shame becomes so prevalent and it amplifies and takes
Yeah.
over.
Yeah. Yeah. Like I say in the book, shame is like the linchpin, I think, of addiction. I think it's that through line. I think it's underneath it all. And it's this overwhelming feeling that something is inherently wrong with you, that there's nothing you can do about it. And of course that isn't true, but I think it takes time and it takes work to process that and to uncover all of that. And I always advise people, and in the book I advise people that when they're dealing with shame, to seek out help, in terms of seeking out help and talking to a counselor, a trained therapist, to help themselves work through the shame, get to some of the underlying beliefs around themselves that lead them to have this certain amount of shame and carry it with them. Uh, because I feel as though it's something that we all experience and we all need support around it. And it's just important that it's addressed.
Yeah, and I do like the fact that you said that you should seek a counselor, because a lot of people, I feel, want to do it on their own or don't think they need someone. But the more support we have, or you have, or anyone has, I think the easier life becomes,
Hmm.
and we don't have to do it on our own.
Yeah. I think I quote Brene Brown in the book, which she said that shame needs three things to survive. It's secrecy, silence, and judgment. So if we keep our shame a secret, it will just fester. If we stay silent about it, it will grow. If we judge ourselves, it almost feels as though it's insurmountable. So I think working with someone, working through the processes in the book will help people to begin to dismantle that shame. But it's something that I feel as though the mind of a person in active addiction needs help moving beyond and outside of their own thinking around it. So that's why it's important to reach out and get the help that you need, because your mind may have already be going around and around in circles, that's not very helpful in order for you to move towards a solution. And in this particular uh, moment, we're talking about shame, but we need outside help to help us get past this circular thinking around your shame and whatever you're carrying, and this feeling of being not worthy, or being uh, bad to the core, which is not the truth, but it's hard to see that for yourself.
Yeah, especially when behavior becomes something that's on loop as well, because habits become, an endless loop, and it's
Yes,
hard to see outside of the habits of your current habits. Just the
right.
same way it's hard to see outside of your current shame and fear. And having somebody support you and see outside of that and guide you towards the path and pull you out of the cycle. It's like a hamster on a hamster wheel. You just got to pull them out to know that if they run, they can actually run forward and they're not stuck in the cage, or they're not stuck in this wheel.
Yes. Yes, and I'll add one more thing. I think there's a definitely a connection between the two things that we're talking about and the solutions that I'm talking about when it comes to fear and shame and everything else, is that we need community. We need relationships with people. I think we tend to sit in isolation with our fear and our shame, and that's just going to create more fear and shame. But once we let people in, we ask for help, starting with people that we feel safest with. This is how we begin to move out of it.
I agree. I mean, isolation is one of the leading causes, I think, of addiction, because a lot of time addiction is a self-soothing mechanism. And when people are isolated or don't have someone to take care of them or just soothe them, they turn to self-soothing. And it starts, when you're young, it starts as like something so harmless, and it just escalates into something bigger and bigger and bigger. So
Right.
I feel that's why the 2020 was crazy because when it came to addiction, I think all the addicts became super addicts
Yeah.
because you not only had isolation, you had a lot of time and a lot of boredom, a lot of judgment, a lot of, thinking about life and self and future and where you are and
And
all of this
fear.
judgment. Yeah, fear.
I'm sorry to interrupt you, but I think also there was so much information being pumped out in the world that was had this vibration of fear. And so we internalize that and add that on top of the fear that we were already feeling. So it just becomes this behemoth.
It is definitely something that has not stopped because the fear keeps growing for good reason because the world is changing. It always has. And at this moment in time, we have these cameras and these newscasters and all this social media and everything just amplifying it so we can see it. And it gets scarier and the world gets scarier and the future seems so bleak, but we always find a way as humans to work our way through it because
Mhm.
if you look at the world right now, it's not quite as bad as it was 200 years ago. People were killing each other way more for territory. It was just the amount of peace that's on planet Earth is more than has ever been. The technology that we have, the medicine that we have, everything that we have is so much better than it ever was. But people, of course, our nature is to be fearful because we don't know what's ahead.
Amen
And,
to that.
and but that's why we self-soothe. And it's really important to find healthy habits to replace your negative habits.
I
And
agree.
it could be shopping, it could be watching too much television, it could be shooting up heroin. It doesn't really matter what it is.
Mhm.
That's why I feel that dancing and movement is one of the most sacred things on this planet because I have spoken to God through dance
Mhm.
or my inner self, my higher self. I've done so much through dance. And that's why I resonate so much with your message, with your energy, with your vibration, because I've seen firsthand the power of movement. Movement is key because even if you can't mentally figure out what to do, what to think, how to think, as soon as you start moving your body, it's almost like you tap into higher consciousness and new insights starts flowing through you.
Yes.
But the thing that it does to me, and I think that's what you are talking about in this book, primarily for people who are not deep thinkers, is that it releases energy and it just gets the flow going and it makes you not have cravings anymore or that it lessens the degree of cravings. Would you say that is accurate?
I agree. I think, like you said a moment ago, these practices, like movement, are ways to self-soothe. And when we're able to tap into the body and in the breath and connect to the body and the body-mind connection, we stop overthinking and worrying. We connect to the body, and then suddenly I feel as though the medicine works its way through you, and it allows you the space to come up with solutions, to find your truth. Absolutely.
And will you
Uh,
define what you mean when you said the word medicine?
mhm. So when I say medicine, I think of movement medicine. Like for instance, Qigong is movement medicine. Uh, Qigong is a ancient Chinese healthcare system that combines flowing movement, standing postures, deep breathing, focused intention to activate, cultivate, and circulate life force energy. So when we do the movements, when we connect to the breath and when we pay attention to what we're doing as we do it, the medicine is able, the life force energy that lives within you is able to move and circulate. What tends to happen with our energy is that it becomes stuck and stagnant. And sometimes that stagnation creates tension in the body. Sometimes it creates heavy emotions that don't seem to move. And also, it creates a lot of energy in the head. So, a lot of overthinking, a lot of worry, a lot of anxiety. Now, when we engage in practices like Qigong, it helps to get everything to flow. We get that body, mind, and spirit connection as well, because when we're able to relax the body and calm the mind, we're able to receive. The channel is open, but you have to move through that process in order for that to take place. And because life is so busy and so chaotic, oftentimes and frenetic, we're so focused on everything that's coming at us, we don't connect to ourselves, to our deepest part of ourselves, where there is healing medicine within us. We just have to tap into it. And part of the way that we tap into it is by doing these practices to self-regulate, right?
Absolutely. And our brain is basically a pharmacy
Mm-hmm.
that releases anything you want to release. And sometimes some of the chemicals we take are not necessarily the chemicals that help. They're the ones that signal to our brain to release the chemicals that make us feel better. So, doing all of this, I believe when you said the word medicine, it's an activating your inner medicine.
Right.
Feel that it is good to be aware that a lot of the medicine does come from your own chemical factory that you have in your body, and allowing yourself to breathe or move activates hormones
Mm-hmm.
that make you feel so good. Which brings me to this question, because it might not sound related, but it is. And my question is, what stage of recovery do you think is more benefited, or is this book more beneficial for, and these exercises? What stage of recovery is recommended?
That's a really good question. I love that you asked that question. Thank you. Okay. I feel called to share a story with you, if you will indulge me.
I would love to.
And I'll try to be as concise as I can be because it is related to your question. I recently had the experience of helping a loved one find their way to recovery. This loved one has been struggling with alcohol addiction for years. And I had been an example for them of recovery, but they were never ready to follow suggestions that I had offered over the years. And so I just had to hold space for them, right? And just recently, they finally became willing to try something new and to enter in recovery. I had never seen them as willing as they were in that moment. So from that moment they became willing, fast forward 24 to 48 hours, they were on a plane from the East Coast to the West Coast, and they entered a treatment facility that caters to all women, just a few women, that works on trauma and works on the underlying issues of addiction. And then from there, they were able to learn practices like mindful movement, journaling, going through counseling, having also medicinal intervention as well to help them detox, art therapy, meditation, mindfulness practices, all of these things together helping to help someone to begin their recovery journey. It's 55, 60 days later now. And what I was very encouraged by being there with them through part of their process, was to see how all the practices that were offered in this treatment center, there were so many things that were in alignment with what I teach in the book. Connecting to the body, connecting to the breath, moments of time, exercises for self-reflection, for self-inquiry, somatic work, all those things were very useful. But the first thing that had to be done, of course, was when you're in a situation where you are when you're in a critical state, when you need emergency care, you have to tend to that. You have to stop the bleeding first. And then once you stop the bleeding, then you can start to introduce other things that are going to help, and the things that you can build upon to grow. So to answer your question, I think this book and the practices are for everyone. Initially, there are certain things that may need to take place before someone is open enough to do what's recommended and suggested in the book. But that's not to say that they can't benefit from everything that's in the book, or pieces of it when they are ready to use them and to implement them. And this book is also for people who, like myself, have long-term sobriety and just want to go deeper into my self-care practices.
When did you become sober?
I got sober 20 years ago.
That's a long time.
20 years ago, one day at a time, one day at a time.
Do you still feel triggered or have cravings?
I do sometimes have feel triggered and sometimes have cravings, but they're very subtle. They don't last very long. It's like a passing thought.
And you probably don't have the reflex to reach for whatever it is you used to reach for, because new habits have probably overridden the old habits. 'Cause I think
Yeah.
a new addict usually will immediately reach for their phone or their liquor cabinet or wherever it is. I
Hmm.
feel like when you have enough time, then the habits are just less loud.
Yeah. But I have to say, going off what you just said, it's important to note that just because for me that I'm someone with a lot of time in sobriety, it doesn't mean that I don't have to continue to do the work. Because the thing about addiction is that it has the ability to morph and shapeshift and turn into something else, whether it's suddenly you find yourself watching too much television, or suddenly you find yourself watching too much of the news, or you're eating in ways that aren't healthy. There's so many different things that can facilitate you checking out and numbing out. So it takes time, it takes diligence to stay on top of that. And sometimes you do allow yourself to get a little far away in one area, and then you have the tools in which to identify that and then to pull it back and come
Yeah,
into balance.
I do know all about when you stop one addiction, another one can develop so easily from all the people that I've seen and my own behavior. You immediately, turn to sugar or whatever it is that makes you feel good. That's why I
Yeah.
think the exercises in this book are so valuable, because if you're going to be addicted to something or have addictive behavior, might as well have it be something that's really good for you, because you can never do too much deep breathing or learn new breathing exercises, or give yourself some self-love, or take up a hobby that's really helpful. And so I think that if you're going to replace your addiction, there is still really good stuff to replace, because some people just have addictive personalities. They like
Mhm.
to really go all out. Now, I'm an extremist, so I love to do everything, you know, times 100.
Go big or go home.
Mhm. But it's really good when I'm working or when I'm doing really, you know, productive things. But when it comes to, unproductive things, it's not good, because then I will binge watch 6 seasons all at once
Yeah.
and lose sleep. And it's my kids are awake and it's time to take them to school, so I just take them to school and come back and take a nap or go to the
Yeah.
next episode. It's I no one is perfect, and I think that it's really important to acknowledge that nobody is perfect, even
Yes.
somebody who will write a wonderful book such as
Amen.
yours.
Amen. Thank you for saying that. It's so true. Now, if you hadn't said it, I was going to say it. That just because for instance, when I got sober, I thought that my life was suddenly going to become perfect, and that things weren't going to bother me, and that I was going to rise above really being human and the things that we deal when we're spiritual beings having a human experience. And that's not true. What I think recovery has taught me is just how to navigate that stuff with some tools, so that I don't go off the rails like I had in the past. So I think that's really important to mention. And then also that when I think about all the other ways that one can check out and sort of numb themselves or distract themselves, I feel as though it's all in terms of addiction, it's all on a spectrum, right? You have one extreme and then you have the other. So it's just a matter of where you are on that spectrum. And I feel as though for myself, if I go to a slightly uncomfortable place in one direction with another type of behavior, I can always look back at where my life has been before and take some sort of comfort in knowing that, A, I'm aware of what's happening right now in the moment, and I'm also aware that I'm not where I was before. So that gives me options, that gives me choices, that gives me, in some sense, solutions too.
Well, because we never reach perfection. And I love one of
Mm-mm.
the things that I learned during my many, many certifications and degrees, which was don't seek perfection because you'll always fail, but seek excellence by being better than you ever were. Outdo yourself. And if you fail, it's okay.
Yes.
And I'm going to just add something because I know some of the people listening right now are not in recovery mode. They're in full addict mode because I know a lot of addicts are drawn to books or episodes that are talking about recovery, but they're not quite ready to be in a state of recovery. They want to still do what that they want to, but they're still in the grips of whatever it is they're going through. And I just wanted to say that, first of all, this book and the exercises are just as valuable for somebody who is high as hell. Because when you do these exercises, when you become self aware, when you journal, when you become aware of your behavior, or when you try to tap into higher consciousness by these exercises, you do get better insight, whether you're sober or whether you're not. So don't feel that you have to wait to be sober to read this or to do any of these exercises, because regardless of whether you're high on drugs or you're sober, you're always on a spectrum of how connected you are to source and higher intelligence, how much energy is moving through you, or how stagnant you are and how disconnected you are. So it's always a fluctuating thing. And it's good to acknowledge that regardless of where you are,
Yeah.
take the time to care about yourself and do exercises and create habits that help you connect. And you never have to wait until you are in recovery,
Yes.
because self-care is how you end up overcoming certain things and how you become aware of your behavior. And sometimes in pre-recovery, in the midst of your addiction, you are not aware that you are addicted or that you're being destructive. So I just
Yes.
did want to emphasize the value of these exercises for somebody who is going through a hard time. Something you do in this book might actually help you quit.
Yeah, absolutely. And I also, that's, thank you for saying that, because I think I can also add to that. My journey has been sobriety and abstinence, right? But that's not everyone's journey. Not everyone is going to achieve abstinence and have continuous sobriety. For some people, they'll have periods of sobriety or periods of abstinence, and then they'll go back to whatever it is that they are addicted to. But who's to say that those moments of sobriety or abstinence, that they don't gain something, or even in the midst of the chaos, that if something like this were introduced to them, that they wouldn't get something out of it. So I think it's important, like you say, to go on the journey, whatever it looks like. And I say this at the end of the book, that even if you don't find this freedom that you seek, if you haven't found it through the process of this book, don't worry about it, because the things that you've experienced and learned, no one can take that away from you. It's a part of you, and you can always go back to it when you need it. It's here for you. So I think it's important to know that is, it's the journey is going to look like whatever it's going to look like for each and every individual, and all are welcome.
I'm glad you said that because every new year I quit I am a tequila person, by the way. If anybody wants to know, I just love tequila. I can go through half a bottle in one night really easily without a hangover. Um, and every New Year, I always say, going sober. And sometimes it lasts 2 months, sometimes it lasts 9 months, sometimes it lasts 24 hours. And then I, find myself either back to my old habits or, I'm clear headed. But regardless, the funny thing is, I still try to do things that are good for me, whether I am drinking my tequila at night or not. That's why I am recommending this book, because I probably read half of this while I was taking shots of tequila. So, and I found, and I had to try some of the exercises, massages and things. And I found a lot of pleasure from it. And the thing is, if you're doing something that feels good, you're less likely to reach for the other thing that feels good because you're already feeling good.
Right.
So now we talked about fear, shame, isolation. Now let's go to the final two that you mentioned in your book, which and might not be the final two, but the final two
Mm-hmm.
that I wrote down, which was faith and gratitude.
Mm-hmm.
And we will briefly touch on those if you don't mind before our time runs out.
Yeah, absolutely. I felt it was important to mention gratitude in the book because that's something that can be lost and forgotten on the road to recovery. There's, I know for myself, a tendency to focus on what's wrong instead of what's right. And when we focus on what's wrong or what's not right, we tend to get more of that. But if we're able to shift our perception and shine a light on what's happening in life today that is actually good, and you don't have to look far in order to find things to be grateful for. Someone recommended when I first got into recovery to make a gratitude list. And at first, I would look at other people and think, oh, well, that's good for them, but I don't know if that's going to benefit me. But you don't know it. You don't know what you can gain from it until you actually start to do it. And it's actually a really powerful tool. And there's tons of research out there that shows that being grateful rewires the brain. And it creates this overwhelming feeling of well-being and joy and contentment if you invest in it and actually do it and are consistent with it.
It's kind of like journaling. So many people think that they don't really need to journal or it's not for them.
Hmm.
That they finally start journaling and they're like, what the heck is this?
Yeah. And if you're not someone who likes or feels drawn to journaling, doing a simple gratitude list or journal is a great way to have a semblance of that, to just put some of your thoughts down on paper. There's tons of apps out there too that where you can just write your journal, your gratitude list down and just collect it over time. So there's a wonderful way to do it. And you can, and I suggest in the book too, you don't have to write it down. You can also use your phone to take photographs of things that you love or that you're grateful for throughout the day. And then you go back later on and you review it, and it gives you this sense of gratitude. And it's even more amazing when you can take that gratitude and share it with another person.
Absolutely. Because
Yeah.
there's no higher frequency than gratitude. I feel like
Right.
that is the highest. Love and gratitude, which I feel go hand in hand, are the highest frequencies in the
Yeah.
world that you can tap into. And life does become magical when you tap into those frequencies and energies, which brings me to the last thing, which is faith.
Mhm.
How valuable do you think is faith? And what are we supposed to have faith in?
I think I think it's very valuable to have faith, to find some sense of faith, and I talk about it a lot in the book. I talk about how the faith is not necessarily in something that's outside of yourself, but also faith and trust in yourself and your ability to make better decisions, to guide your life. I know that for me, it took me time to develop a faith, or for me, a faith in a power greater than myself. And recovery and in the world in general, you have people who believe in God or they don't believe in God or have issues with God or what have you. No matter where you fall on that on that spectrum, I think we can all agree that there are powers that are greater than each of us as human beings, right? There's powers, there's energy around us that's greater than us and that we're able to tap into. And sometimes that is nature of the universe, but sometimes it's the consciousness of a group of people. I think about when I first entered recovery and went to 12-step recovery, sometimes the energy of the group was a force that was greater than me, that I was able to tap into. Like the moments when I wasn't sure if I was going to be able to meet whatever challenge that was ahead of me. For instance, I think about, off the top of my head, I think about when I lost my stepmother when I was maybe a year sober. And I was so worried that the sorrow and the sadness that I felt was going to engulf me and I wouldn't be able to make it through it sober. But the power of the group showed me that all things are possible and that I could make it through that challenging experience and maintain my sobriety. But in and of myself, I didn't know that. I didn't feel that, but there was something about this group and the energy and hearing people's stories of how they've navigated things like that, that gave me the faith to know that I could walk into that period of my life and be okay.
Another thing I want to say before we wrap up, because I really do want this to be as much information for anyone going through this as possible. And I know I'm interviewing you, but I tend to babble and say a lot of stuff. But I think sometimes I think about something my listener will say or my viewer will say or think, and I feel obliged to answer it. And one of the things is a lot of times people that are going through addiction or they have something that they are addicted to do have a sense of community with others that do the same drug or alcohol that they do, and they feel like the community comes from that, and they feel that when you give up your drug you lose your friends. And I just wanted to just make a statement that I know is true, and that when you do stop, yes, you will lose some people, but as soon as you go on active recovery, or when as soon as you begin active recovery, there's a whole nother world of people that are there to hold your hand, support you, and they know exactly what you're going through, whether you do 12 steps or any other form of program. Because I don't resonate with the 12 steps, but I know there's so many other things that are out there. It's good
Yeah,
to see what's available.
absolutely. Absolutely.
So basically, we are coming to an end of our interview. I want to see if you have anything else you want to say to my viewers, to my listeners, to your readers, or if anything you want them to take away from this interview or your book.
Yes, thank you so much for this opportunity. 3 things. What I would love for people to take from this interview and also from the book is a sense that they are not alone. That whatever it is that they're going through, that they're not alone. There are people out there who understand, who've been where they are, and know what the struggle is. Second thing is I want people to know that they are worthy of recovery. They're worthy of transformation. They're worthy of change, because sometimes when you are in the thick of it, you don't feel that sense of worthiness. So I want people to know that. And then lastly, as we've talked about in this whole hour, there are so many tools that you can use that can help you live a more joyous and conscious life. So this book offers a myriad of tools that you can use to do that. So those are the things that I want people to take away from this conversation, this beautiful conversation. Thank you, Happy, and from the book.
Thank you so much for joining me. Recovering You is out this week on November 15th. Make sure to purchase it, read it, pass it on. I think it's very, very valuable. And like I said before, and anyone who watched this interview or listened to this interview noticed, every single thing that we talked about is for every single person, whether they're addicts, not addicts, whether they just want to be better people, whether they want to have access to higher intelligence or be the best version of themselves. This is not a book that's just for people who are recovering. Like I said, we're all recovering from something and we're all on our way to something greater. Thank you again, Stephen. It was such a pleasure having you on my show. You are an amazing human being. Your energy is beautiful. And thank you so much to everyone listening or watching. And please make sure to write a review. You can find Stephen's work at stephenwashingtonexperience.com. And thanks again. Please write a review and have a beautiful day. Goodbye.